So
you stay in the area, or you try to
well, no, I'm gonna be moving back home. Not that I really want to, but and then.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. We greatly appreciate your attendance and participation. I also want to welcome those who are watching this event via the Ripon College Live Events YouTube channel. I am Henrik Schatzinger, co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, and on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Brian Smith, it is my honor to introduce this event. Today we will discuss local environmental issues, and the presentations are meant to be both informational and I also heard debatable to a certain extent. And our speakers will address two issues: the quality of water. I hear the Clean Water Act will be on the agenda, and looking at the role of the local, state, and federal government. And then we'll talk about the relationship between the frac sand mining industry in Wisconsin and those who regulate the industry. To discuss these issues, we are lucky to have two distinguished guests with us. We have Ripon alumnus David Schwartz, class of 65 and attorney, and also Ripon College adjunct professor Steve Sorenson. David Schwartz started his career in the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, in 1980. During his 30-year career at the EPA, he worked in various influential capacities. This included the management of regulatory development and promoting and advancing the use of electronic reporting by industries to federal, state, and local environmental agencies. In addition to his degree from Ripon College, Schwartz holds a Bachelor of Philosophy in Logic and Metaphysics from the University of St. Andrews, and he also holds a PhD in Philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley. He taught philosophy at Mount Holyoke College, the University of Connecticut, and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He also has published a book and several journal articles about the philosophy of language. Switching over to Steve Sorenson. Steve Sorenson is a widely known attorney who provides counsel on corporate law, business, succession planning, and estate planning. He also represents municipalities, and with regard to real estate, he counsels on land use, zoning, smart growth, waterfront litigation, and non-metallic mining. Widely known and respected by his peers, Steve Sorenson has served in many capacities with the State Bar of Wisconsin, including terms as president and secretary, as well as chairing several of their standing committees. We are also very lucky to have Steve as an adjunct professor in both my home department, politics and government, as well as the business here at the college. Steve is also a frequent lecturer on legal ethics, real estate law, and waterfront rights, and he is a fellow of both the Wisconsin Law Foundation and the American Bar Foundation. The way it's going to work is that David Schwartz, I believe, will start by focusing on the quality of water, and then Steve Sorenson will talk about the frac sand mining industry and its regulations, and how the media has also covered this issue. After the talk, we will have time for questions from the audience, and before we start, I also want to really thank the advisory board members from the CPP who are here today. And so we do have Judge Wilcox, Bob Welch, Rob Carl, Rick Lewandowski. Let's see, we're all three here and four in the first row. And so we are honored to have them here with us today, and they have been also instrumental in supporting the center from the start. So really appreciate your presence. So with all that being said, let's give a nice welcome to both David Schwartz and Steve Sorenson.
Slides? No.
So is this on? No, it's not on. It's on now?
It is on.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the relationship between the federal and state roles in environmental protection with some focus on clean water. So just being able to chew gum and walk at the same time here. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of environmental regulation. The basic challenge of environmental regulation is that there are certain environmental assets that are necessary to life itself, and certainly also to the quality of life: clean air, clean water, safe drinking water, and well-managed waste. And the problem is that some economic activities, especially in manufacturing and farming, tend to threaten those assets because they produce waste, they produce byproducts, they get into the environment and cause problems. The challenge is that marketplace forces by themselves don't seem to mitigate these harms in general. Everything else being equal, a company that spends less on being clean has a competitive advantage over its peers that spend more. So historically, localities mainly, towns, cities, counties, and states, have imposed some sort of restriction on at least manufacturing activities. Okay. So there is nonetheless some problems with local solutions, and I've identified 4 here. The first is simply a question of resources. It may be easy enough to see that there are environmental problems, but to figure out what to do about them, what the appropriate solutions are, is often not obvious, complicated, technical, and even for localities that do have the resources to develop a viable approach, there's the risk that they will sort of be just reinventing the wheel and spending resources that have already been spent someplace else. A second problem is that from the perspective of industry, if you have locality by locality solutions, that imposes extra burden on companies, particularly those that want to operate nationally. I remember talking with someone who worked for Santa Fe as their environmental manager, and he was complaining about the difficulty just of 50 different forms for hazardous waste and what a burden that created. So you just lose all opportunities for economies of scale if you do locality by locality environmental control. A third problem is that there is a risk of racing to the bottom. That is, to the extent that states and localities compete for economic development, there is a temptation, to offer special accommodation that compromises environmental protection for economic growth. And then lastly, the truth is that environmental problems do cross state lines. So effluent that leaves some pipe in Arkansas will find its way down the river to Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's another problem for local solutions. So in the 1960s and early 70s, a consensus arose that we really needed a national approach to environmental protection. And so Congress passed the first set of comprehensive national environmental laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and for hazardous waste, something called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And among other things, the laws define certain roles for the federal government and certain roles for states who are already in the business of environmental protection. And it created a new federal agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, which I think opened its doors in 1972. So let's look at the federal and state roles. The federal role, first and foremost, is to do the heavy lifting of technical analysis and legal analysis, to first of all define meaningful environmental goals. For example, the question, how clean is clean for purposes of clean air and clean water? One might think that, well, clean is absolutely pure, but of course that's unrealistic. So that was an issue that took a good deal of analysis and debate. And then once you have the goal established, the question is what you have to do to meet those goals. Considering, for example, how much of a pollutant a clean environment will tolerate, what technology can do, what's available. And then there are also questions of what are reasonable costs and burdens that you can impose on industry that is not going to throttle economic growth. So that's one thing that the federal government does. And then based on what emerges from this analysis, the federal role is also to set standards for state and local environmental programs, including such things as what state environmental laws have to provide, and what sort of state environmental infrastructure and management practices there have to be. For example, appropriate permitting programs, testing, monitoring, enforcement, and so on. In addition, the federal role is also to ensure that states meet the standards by, and this is very important, first of all, providing a stream of federal resources through such things as federal grants. Second, by reviewing and certifying state and local environmental programs and approving them so that they count as authorized. And then making sure that, in fact, that the programs perform so that they continue to meet the standards. So the federal role with regard to the states is not to replace what states are doing, but rather to govern, to oversee the states, and let the states actually do the job of environmental management. The only exception is that where a state cannot or does not wish to get federal approval, then in fact the federal government has to step in and actually run the environmental program in a state. So that's the federal role. Not surprisingly, the state role is basically to run their programs in compliance with the standards, for example, by providing necessary legislation so that state laws give the state authority to do whatever it is that they need to do, to set up agencies and processes to oversee the affected industries, and to create the infrastructure they need, information systems, monitoring systems, laboratories, and so on. And then also to have a credible enforcement program. Generally, federal standards allow states a great deal of flexibility in exactly what they do, how they set up their programs, as long as they do meet the federal standards. And a state may certainly have more stringent requirements than the federal government requires. And for example, a state like California is noted for having some of the most stringent environmental standards in the country. So let's look then at an example, and this is where we turn to talking about the Clean Water Act. And I just put up here some of the opening language of the Clean Water Act, which sets out the general objective of the Act, which is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and then certain goals that it sets out to meet that objective, which include the goal that the discharge of pollutants into the navigable waters of the U.S., that is lakes, rivers, and streams, be eliminated by 1985. And I have to pause and say that that goal is somewhat quaint in view of the deadline, because of course has not yet been met, although there's been considerable progress. Similarly, there's a goal that wherever attainable, there's water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. And that was to be achieved by July 1st, 1983. Again, not quite there, but there certainly has been progress. And then the third goal is to prohibit the discharge of toxic pollutants into the waterways of the United States. So those are the goals, and the Act specifies a number of other things that define the federal role in having these goals met. And one of the major components of a federal program that the Clean Water provides for is something called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NIPIDs as it's called. In Washington, we love acronyms. NIPIDs distinguishes between direct discharge of wastewater into a lake, river, or stream, that is an actual pipe that comes from a company facility and discharges effluent, and indirect discharge where the effluent goes through a sewage system to some sort of public treatment works, a publicly owned treatment work, or POTW, as it's called. So for direct discharge, NIPIDs includes the provision of industry-specific standards, often referred to as effluent guidelines, that are based on best available technology, and that's something that's mandated by the Clean Water Act. And this is often supplemented by other water quality-based standards that reflect the use of the body of water. If it's something that people are going to fish from or swim in, then that may imply the need to regulate certain things further. And then NIPIDs sets up and defines a permitting program, a way to set facility, in fact, sort of pipe by pipe, specific pollutant limits for wastewater. And it includes requirements to monitor and test wastewater samples to make sure that the company or facility is actually meeting these standards. For indirect discharge, the standards and permitting apply to the publicly owned treatment work, so it's the municipal wastewater facility that gets the regulation, and that facility in turn regulates the facility that emits water to its system. So that's at least a part of the federal role under the Clean Water Act, is to set up this NIPIDs system of standards for direct and indirect discharge. The state role is to actually, in the case of direct discharge, is to actually run the permitting programs for the facilities in their state. So they actually, the state then has permit writers that actually go from facility to facility, and they issue permits for direct, in some cases for indirect discharge of wastewater that comply with the federal effluent guidelines and applicable standards. In addition to that, the state, in addition, has to follow certain process requirements. There has to be opportunity, for example, for public review and public comment of these permits. The state, in addition, is supposed to monitor the facility's compliance with permits by reviewing reports and conducting inspections and then taking appropriate enforcement action. And then, of course, the state also has to pass the legislation that they need to give them the authority to do these things. So in Wisconsin, there is such a program under NIPIDs, and it's called WIPIDs, not surprisingly, which is currently authorized to do all these things. And you can look at its activities. I've given you the website address, and I encourage you to check it out. And you can see what WIPIDs is doing. So the question then is, given that we have a state program here that's authorized under the Clean Water Act by EPA, the question is, how is it doing? So, how do you answer that question? Well, if there's been a highly visible environmental event, I mean, for example, if Green Lake turns brown, then that may be an easy question to answer. But otherwise, it's difficult because running environmental programs is highly technical and legally complex. For example, most permits are written by engineers who have to understand the industrial processes of the facilities being regulated, and they have to understand which effluent guidelines actually apply and how they apply to those processes, and what they actually require. So all that requires a great deal of complexity. You really do have to be an engineer in order to know whether it's being done properly. And then if you look at enforcement policy, that can be complicated too. I mean, it's not often a simple black or white thing of, well, the facility is complying or the facility is not complying. Enforcement often considers legal precedent, compliance agreements, allowance for anomalies. I mean, sometimes things happen that are beyond the control of the company. You know, ongoing relationships with facilities. You know, what kind of progress is the facility making? You know, what's good public policy, and so on and so forth. So, for a concerned citizen, it can be often difficult to make a judgment about what's really going on and are the requirements of the Clean Water Act really being met in Wisconsin. But there is help. There are, for example, organizations that try to figure out these questions. Nationally, there's the EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club. There are U.S. public interest research groups, or U.S. PIRG as it's known, and these all, of course, have websites. And locally, there are also PIRGs and other groups. EPA also offers useful information, and if, as it happens, if you look at this web address, which I will not attempt to read out, but it's there for the record, what do we see? We see that there is actually a current citizens petition to withdraw EPA's approval of WIPIDs based on failure to meet NIPIDs standards. It's filed by a group called the Midwest Environmental Advocates, which is a Wisconsin-based nonprofit environmental law center, and their web address is up there as well. The EPA site also documents ongoing negotiations between EPA and the state of Wisconsin to address the petition's issues. So whatever the exact merits of the petition, we do know that EPA and the state of Wisconsin have taken them seriously enough to try to work through them over the past 3 years. These are discussions that are still ongoing. So what can we learn from the petition? Well, one thing we can learn is that there are organizations in Wisconsin that are equipped to provide educated answers to questions about the state's environmental programs. That, you know, there are people who are doing research into this. Second thing we can learn if we look at the summary of the petition is that at least from MEA's point of view, rightly or wrongly, that, for example, Wisconsin's regulations allow a lowering of water quality without showing that new or increased discharge is necessary. Second thing is that Wisconsin law lacks the opportunity for public input regarding whether lowering of water quality is necessary or will accommodate social or economic development. This is one of the requirements for public participation that's built into NIPIDs in the Clean Water Act. And the petition here is saying that this is not being honored in Wisconsin. And the third thing it says is that Wisconsin repeatedly issues WIPIDs permits that violate the requirements of the Clean Water Act. Now, I'm not going to try to assess the merits of these claims here, but the 90-page petition document is available on the EPA website. And I commend it to you. It's readable, it's interesting, and it's educational, and it gives very specific examples of problems that have led to the petition. Anyway, if the claims do have merit, then WIPIDs is operating in a way that potentially does compromise the water quality in Wisconsin. So, just a few concluding thoughts. If you are concerned about Wisconsin's environment, there are a number of things you could do. You could learn more about the Midwest Environmental Advocates. You could read the petition document. You could see if there are other groups that are following these issues and what they have to say. You could find out how the state of Wisconsin has responded. And if you're sufficiently moved, you could contact your state legislators, educate your neighbors, and vote. And with that, I will leave it then to you.
Good afternoon. Hello. You always say that just so you know it works or not. We can have everybody move down to the front if they'd like. There's plenty of room by a former justice of the Supreme Court. There's all kinds of wonderful places to sit if you'd like to come down. And as a professor, I enjoy when people stand up and walk around in my class. So please feel free to do so. It won't bother me a bit. But you don't have to stand at the back. This is going to be long and boring, I guarantee you. No. My name is Steve Sorenson, as I was introduced earlier, and the interesting thing is, and this is very, very typical when I speak, and I kind of warned David of this before, I completely changed my presentation while he was talking. And those of you that do know me probably saw facial expressions. Because there's a lot of things out there that I'd like to talk about, and I normally only have 3 hours, so I'd like to put this into some kind of a context. I have a really nice, beautiful speech written up, if anyone would like it. But I think I want to talk about some real key points. I'm going to go over some of the last things that were said, because I think they're really, really important to understand. And then I'm going to go back into the context of kind of the position that I would like to take. And I think it'll open up a really great dialogue in the room. And that's really what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a dialogue. I don't have nearly the experience that David has. I've never worked for the EPA. I've never worked for the Department of Natural Resources. In fact, I've always worked against them, they would say. But yet, we always seem to find a way to solve the problem. I've never had litigation, well, that's not quite true. I've won litigation against the DNR, I won, and they've been nice ever since. But the bottom line is you have to learn to work in a cooperative world because that's the world we live in. And I'm going to talk about how that cooperative world exists, especially if we talk about clean water. One of the things I want to quickly point out is the Wisconsin law, despite what it was mentioned, does have significant input on any legislation, any rule or regulation. I happen to have been for 18 months the head of a Wisconsin state agency, and we went out and did rule changes, and I will guarantee you that we spent many, many hours in empty rooms around the state of Wisconsin waiting for people to come talk to us, because under Wisconsin law, and I'm sure Bob could tell you this, Rich, you're required to reach out to the public and you're required to go to their location. You can't make them always come to Madison to chit-chat with you. So I can tell you for sure that there's been significant impact statewide on the opportunities to discuss the Clean Water Act, to discuss many of the regulations. Particularly, I know from the mining world, which is a world that I operate in, and somewhat of the agricultural world, we've had numerous statewide hearings. I went to several of them. Oftentimes, you really just listen to the same speakers over and over again at these meetings, but the impact is there. You do have the opportunity, you do have the way to reach out, not only to the department, and as a department head, I really enjoyed listening to people talk instead of the regular lobbyists, no offense. But the reality is that we do have input, and we have a lot of input when it comes to Wisconsin environmental issues, and we have lots of people that attend those meetings and lots of input by those people. So that's a misstatement if somebody has suggested that. There's a couple other misstatements, and this is one of the bigger points that I'd like to make. There's a presumption, and I think that presumption has got to fall, and it's got to fall right now. And that presumption is that if you don't favor the Clean Air Act, you're evil. There's a presumption that if I don't think the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Act, or the various acts that have been passed by the United States or by the state of Wisconsin, that somehow I'm evil and I'm against the environment, that I want everybody's water to be polluted, and I'm an evil person. There was a commentator who was a professor from Harvard University, and she's the head of their environmental program, and she made the point very, very well. She said, too many people judge laws by who is supporting the law, not by the law or the purpose of the law. So what her point was, is if President Trump came out and said, we're going to pass a new Clean Water Act, everyone would say, yeah, you bet, that's a terrible act, that's not going to do a doggone thing, it's going to ruin the waters. Whereas if, I'm trying to think, if President Obama had suggested we're going to have a Clean Water Act, everybody would say, yeah, that's beautiful, yes, our waters will be pristine, everything will be wonderful, when in reality it could have been the same act. Now, we know that's not really true, but it could have been the same act, and the result is the same because people are so quick to judge. I mean, I dare say, except for some of our biology professors in the room, that you probably haven't read the Clean Air Act. You don't know the dimensions of it. And I'm certain that most of you don't know how the Clean Water Act impacts the industries of the state of Wisconsin. I mean, I can say that in all honesty because I have sat and represented industries in front of county boards, in front of state committees, and they have no idea what the efforts of the industry is and what the efforts of the industry have been. I mean, my purpose today, I mean, I can talk mining all day long, but I really wanted to deal with some of the concepts that somehow, if you don't support the EPA or you don't support the Department of Natural Resources, you must be wrong. You must be on the wrong side. You must be on the side of big money, is kind of what the advertisements say right now. And that's so far from reality. There's many corporate Americans that are so invested in the environment, it's incredible. I just came back from Florida on the flight back, knowing I had this presentation today. I went and tried to research the companies in the United States today that are dedicated to the environment. And interestingly enough, I mean, the companies you would suspect, you know, Microsoft, the canoe company, Patagonia, well, I can't remember. See, you all knew it, okay? You've got a brewing company out of Colorado, which is Belgium Brewing, New Belgium Brewing. These are the top companies that are listed. One of the companies that's not listed that I was very surprised and I went and researched was Disney. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Disney, but Disney has experimental programs all over the grounds on how to conserve not only the flora and the fauna, but also conserve basically life. And they talk all through the program and they show that. But yet, you know the EPA has fined Disney consistently over the years? And they find them because of certain kind of effluent treatment facilities that they have in their facilities that they're trying to renovate. And this is one of the biggest problems we have, those of us that work in the world of industry, is we spend more time in the world of industry fighting fines for things that didn't hurt anybody than we do being able to carry out the environmental programs we have. Badger Mining Corporation, local company that I worked for a long time, has 4 environmental individuals on their staff. Those staff people spend all day long working on environmental issues, on the protection of the soils, on the protection of the water, on the protection of the air, on the admission systems. I mean, we have a code within the mining industry in the state of Wisconsin that is far superior to the rules that are required from us from the Department of Natural Resources or the EPA. We have our own standards, and if you don't meet those standards, then you're in trouble. There's an ISO 1401 that is our standard in our industry that's far superior to anything that the EPA has ever enacted as far as an air quality standard or a water quality standard, because that's the way we operate. We need to do that in order to sell our products, especially overseas. So when we talk about this, let's understand that we're not evil if we're in industry, we're not evil if we're involved in farming. I mean, most of us in this room came from a farming background. That's true. You know, I always remember that I grew up walking behind the DDT sprayer. You know, it was fun to ride your bike as that big cloud came down the street and you rode through it. Now, some people would say that explains everything, but I think the reality is, yeah, if I did it every day for the rest of my life, it would have certainly affected me in a very negative way beyond what it already has. But the bottom line is, we've lived through some of that stuff and we've grown into that. And industry has discovered the problems. Industry has dealt with those problems. Industry is dealing with those problems on a daily basis. If you ever went to an active mine, I could take you into the filtration systems. I could show you, how the systems work. I could show you what efforts have been taken. But I think it's rather humorous that I can't go into an active mine without going and sitting in a room in a training program. I have to learn how the whole mine works. I have to know all the safety factors. I have to wear a hard hat, glasses. I have to go through this whole training process before I can even get in a truck and drive around the mine. Now, if law enforcement comes on site, they don't have to do any of that. I'll tell you, they're more likely to get hurt than I am. But the reality is the industry has taken a positive approach. One of the things that we need to realize is that there is a commitment to the planet, and there is a commitment to the planet by industry. The commitment has a catchword, and that catchword is corporate environmental responsibility, or sometimes called corporate sustainability. The concept is what the corporations are doing is they've recognized that it's all about the bottom line, you can say that, but it's all about keeping your business viable. And to stay viable in the 21st century, you have to meet the ISO standards. To stay viable in the 21st century, you have to have in place these programs. The problem gets to be, and where you find industry upset with federal enforcement of rules and regulations, is because they are cut in the wool. Everybody has to follow the same standard. There's no flexibility. This is the rule. I can't tell you how many times I've sat with the the Army Corps of Engineers, and I've said, that is not a waterway. And they said, well, there's water there. I said, I understand. When we mine, we pump water out of the ground, it goes and it pools up here on the top of the rock. This is rock mining, not sand mining. It pools up here on the top of the rock, and it sits there until it evaporates. And in fact, it does, I found this out too. Water will actually go through hard rock. It takes a long time, but it will go through it. But yet, I had to fight with somebody from the Army Corps of Engineers who said you can't mine there because that's a waterway. And I said, you know, I could take a pump and it'd be gone tomorrow. He said, you can't, because it's a waterway. And I said, but it wasn't there a week ago. He said, I wasn't here a week ago. And he and I had this go around over in Calumet County, and we went around and round and round, and then we went out and looked at some wildlife, and then we went down to Lake Winnebago, and we talked for a while, we went back, and finally he said, if you can find me a regulation that says I don't have to enforce it, that's fine, but he said, my regulation says I have to enforce it because I found water and it's located in this location, it's this depth, it's this quality of water, and my rules say I have to enforce it. I don't have an exception. And that's kind of the problem. Yes, we solved the problem, we withdrew the permit, we drained the pond, or this puddle, brought him back a few weeks later, and he was very happy with the whole situation, because indeed it wasn't a naturally occurring waterway. It wasn't under their jurisdiction. And that's one of the problems. If you look at the Clean Water Act, and you know that 14 states sued the federal government back in 2015 when the revisions were made in the act, was because nobody could figure out what was a waterway. Nebraska, North Dakota, Wyoming, Nevada, Arizona, all of these states sat out and said, what is a waterway? Is a ditch a waterway? And certain members were saying, yes it is, certain others weren't. And so the bottom line is, this was one of the problems with federal legislation that doesn't allow, one of the attributes of life, of good quality government, is the ability to think. The ability to look at a situation. I'll give you another example, and several of you in the room will like this. This is an example that doesn't have anything to do with clean water and I'm not beat up enough on David. The bottom line is a program that was put into effect several years ago. It's called the Green Thumb Program. Some of my students will know this. The Green Thumb Program, and what it was is farmers in the state of Wisconsin were being pushed off the farm. They just couldn't compete. And so they were leaving the farm, and they didn't have children to take it over, whatever. They were retired farmers. But Green Thumb was, we're going to have them go build tables and buildings at federal and state parks throughout the state of Wisconsin, the federal forest. And it was a Green Thumb, great program. 50 farmers showed up, super program. The government came in and investigated, the Department of Agriculture came in and investigated and wrote up the sponsoring agency. The violation, they were making the farmers start before 9 a.m. in the morning. Because the federal law said you could not start before 9 o'clock in the morning. People of that age could not start working before that time of day. You go tell a farmer in the state of Wisconsin he can't start working until 9 o'clock that day. And I can remember talking to the person in Washington, D.C., they wouldn't send anybody to Wisconsin, and saying to them, this is ridiculous. She said, no it's not. I said, do you understand farming? Yes. I said, but farmers, but they shouldn't. I said, they do, you know. What was the result? The program was, the sponsoring organization gave up, they paid their fine for making the farmers come to work, the program was abandoned, and you don't have it anymore in the state of Wisconsin, it's gone. It's that kind of bureaucracy that comes out when you don't allow local control and local input, and you don't create flexibility in some of these rules and regulations. Because it is not a one system fits all. What is right for California is not right for Wisconsin. What's right for Wisconsin is not right for Illinois. You know, too many people believe you can write one rule that's going to cover the entire United States of America. And the reality is, that's not the way it works. We have to have flexibility, and we have to understand there's differences. There's differences in the state of Wisconsin. If I look at an active sand mine in western Wisconsin and I compare it to a quarry over in eastern Wisconsin, whole different rule. There should be different rules about water, there should be different rules about sediment collection, because there's no filtration system over in the rocks over here, where there's plenty of filtration. And one of the things that I had an argument with the EPA person from Minneapolis that came down, we were at a hearing. I mean, he was talking about the water that's coming out of the mine that we're processing, and he said, you know, it's dirty. And I said, what's it dirty with? He said, all those chemicals. I said, what chemicals? All the chemicals you put in it when you mine it. I said, we don't put any chemicals in when we mine. Yes, you do. I said, no, there's no chemicals that go into mining. Zero, none. So I said, what's making it dirty? Well, it's dirty, you can see it's dirty. Yes, what is that called? It's called clay, it's called sediment. It's naturally occurring materials. There's nothing artificial about it. And how do we clean it up? We filter it through the sand. Isn't that what everybody has when they have a swimming pool in their backyard? They have a sand filter. In fact, I know we sell the sand to the people that put it in their filters to filter their water. So the reality is you can't have the same rule for filtering through sand as you do filtering through rock or filtering through clay. Those are different rules, different entities. Yeah, I know I could talk for, like I said, I have a lot, and I look down and Hendrik's telling me my 20 minutes were up 2 hours ago. And my students are falling asleep, leaving the room, which is, I understand, happens every day. But I thank you for the opportunity, and I don't mean to be overly critical, except I try to open up minds, and I do a lot of that, and I've done a lot of that getting ready for today. There's a lot of things that I found. I'd like to leave you with one story, and this will be the last one. Picture yourself on the LA freeway, 12 lanes, 6 each way. It's the middle of the afternoon. Somebody's driving along, looks down and sees a bag with the skull and crossbones on it. Calls the local government calls the EPA, they say shut down the highway. They shut down the highway. A helicopter comes out, takes a sample of the material that's in this bag with the crossbones on, takes it to UCLA labs, it's investigated, it's determined to be silica sand. Silica sand is a carcinogen, all you people that have played in sandboxes and gone to beaches. Okay? What was the solution? The city crew, or in this case the county crew, took the broom and pushed it off with all the rest of the sand that's on the LA freeway. But you close down. Now that's a gross example. There's lots. It could have been a hazardous material that really could have killed people. I can go through all the, but it says what I'm trying to say. Is there's a need for a little bit of reality, and finally there's a need for trust in business. You know, why don't we start trusting our businesses to do what they say they're going to do? Let's not presuppose that everybody in business is evil and is out to get the environment, is out to destroy. And until they prove us wrong, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. And before we open up for questions, I just wanted to see if David was interested in kind of responding to Steve here. Maybe one question that came up at the end was sort of, why don't we trust businesses? Let's wait basically until something really egregious happens, and then we can respond. Why do we have to be so proactive?
Well, before I respond to that, I guess I wanted to just say 2 things. One, I don't think it was the point of my talk to characterize business as evil. I wasn't really talking about businesses.
I didn't say you said that.
At all. The other thing is that in reality, really the thrust of my talk was that for purposes of most environmental protection, the action is here in Wisconsin. It's not in Washington. And so in a sense, I'm also, I think, supporting some of the things that Ted was saying, that I think that, Wisconsin does have a fair amount of flexibility in how it carries out the Clean Water Act and other acts. And the question is, in exercising that flexibility, are they meeting the mandate? And it's a question I can't answer that question. I don't know enough about the detail of what's going on here in Wisconsin, but what I would like to do is to sort of direct you, those of you who are interested, to some sources like this organization, I forget the name, the Midwest Environmental Advocates, and the Environmental Defense Fund and other PERGs in the area, and acquaint yourself with some of the arguments, some of the examples of people who are concerned. You may not end up agreeing with them. You may end up feeling that things are just fine here, or you may, in fact, end up feeling that some environmental regulations too onerous. But I think that you owe it to yourself to, if you're interested in the environment, to take advantage of groups that have done research and have information for you that tells you what's going on. And that's really all that I'm trying to get you to agree with today.
All right, thank you. So, with that being said, let's open up for questions. Who has questions? Bob?
Bob Wallace, Ripon College biology faculty member and involved with teaching ecological principles for some 40 years. Steve, you talk about trusting as a default system to industry, and I'm not so sure that I can do that because of my own history in terms of study on-site and in the literature. For example, Merco, out of a company that was established out of New York City between 1990 and the year 2000, brought 3 or more train loads of New York City sewage dried down to West Texas in a small town called Sierra Blanca and spread this over some 80,000 acres of land in the Chihuahuan Desert with the idea that they were going to fertilize the land. What they really did is they fertilized it with materials that could not be deposited within New York State because of state law. And it wasn't just because it was sewage, it was because it was sewage from a failing system, so it was loaded with lead, copper, and zinc. So the people in West Texas got all of this stuff just spread all over the place. That's an area that I've seen but have not studied. An area that I studied right out of college was on the Chesapeake Bay, in which a local power plant was releasing toxic chemicals, copper, into the environment from a failing system that had been established. And working for the state of Maryland, we went out in boats to do our sampling to see how much copper and nickel and cadmium was actually coming out of that system. But when they saw our boat, they would shut it down. So I don't trust industries immediately based on those sorts of things and others. We can play this back and forth on it quite a bit. So I really agree, yes, we need to find logical compromises in this thing, but I'm not going to automatically trust an industry or industry in general unless they can demonstrate to me that they actually do have a corporate environmental responsibility. The 2 places I mentioned certainly did not.
So there was a comment about 2 examples, and probably you have more examples of why we should be careful about trusting industry. And just repeating the question for our YouTube viewers.
Yeah, okay, so the question is, can we, I've given you some examples of where industry is messed up, and there's thousands of examples where industry's messed up. I won't deny that, but there's thousands of examples where industry has done a wonderful job. I think you really hit it on the head when you said, maybe I'm not gonna trust them until they show me they have a department. But I think what you'll find is many of your corporations and businesses today, under the concept that if they're going to be around 20 years from now, they're going to have some type of corporate responsibility because shareholders are demanding it. If you look at what is happening in the market in other places, people are investing because of value, and one of the characteristics of value is a corporate responsibility. So I'm telling you that in the 21st century, and I presume your examples are in the 21st century, that the examples in the 21st century really show that industry has taken the vanguard approach and is doing an excellent job of rectifying some of the past, but more importantly, of painting a better path to the future. And I can show you example after example after example, but we'd be here all night doing that.
All right, other questions? Spud.
Steve, I got the idea from what you said, that you didn't think that there was any point in having any federal law, since there were always going to be individual differences in its application. Maybe I misunderstood you.
Yeah, let me
Just again, to repeat the
well.
question. The question was really, should we have any federal law in the first place? Because you said we need flexibility within, not only across states, but also even within states.
No, and I think David said it best. We need a federal policy standard. I mean, that's what the federal government's good at. They've got the money, they've got the resources. They
You weren't
can...
combating that. I took it that, I understood you to be disagreeing with that when you said.
No, I'm talking about the enforcement angle and the on the ground interaction should be left to the state and local. The federal government can help set policy. Do you know how many mandates? Do you know the number one violation that was by EPA last year was you didn't fill out your form correctly? The number one violation. Over $22 million were spent on bad forms. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'm not saying that there isn't a problem with paperwork, but I did understand you to indicate that there could be no general principles.
No, there's general principles. There has to be general principles. I did not say that.
No, you emphasized, you laid on, they're all different. Every one of them is different. What's the point in saying that and not adding? But of course, we have general principles that we have to act on.
And I have no problems with general principles. None. If that's what the EPA did, is they said
I
policy.
misunderstood you.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I'd like to address one of the straw men that Mr. Sorenson set up in saying that there are people who feel that persons who are against environmental protections and clean water, etc., are evil because their intent is to pollute the water or whatever. I don't think that's the case at all. I think people realize that the corporation's only goal is to make profits, and they're oblivious to any destruction that they cause. And you cite this corporate responsibility, etc., and I imagine Herb Kohl is an example of that, building a golf course on pristine land in Wisconsin. And you also mentioned that these corporations have 3-4 environmental scientists on their staff to protect the environment. I don't believe that. Much like Brown Williamson had scientists on their staff that for 20 years denied cancer-causing tobacco, and ExxonMobil had scientists on their staff that proved there was climate change due to human activity 20 years ago, and they buried it. They only have those as a defensive mechanism, not to protect the environment.
So just to summarize again, the question is, our business is just in the business of making money, making profit, without actually really being concerned about the environment. And then as far as staff is concerned, are they really interested, those companies that have people on staff that focus on environmental issues, to really protect the environment, or is it just, as you said, a defensive mechanism?
If you look at the research and you read the materials, 3/4 of the USA companies that are part of the Standard & Poor's 500 publish corporate sustainability reports on a regular basis and in a meaningful way. They voluntarily will establish for you and anyone else that wants to look what their environmental programs are and where they're at and who's carrying them out and who's the staff and who's involved. Corporations are not just about making money. They're about being around for the next generation and sustainability. Well, you can deny me that, but the reality is that's what the research will show. And I think anyone that works in the world of business understands and knows that.
Why is it?
Other questions and comments? Yes, please.
I love to pick on Steve too, but I'm gonna get to the fence. I do think, because I work, and see some of the businesses where I come from, Fond du Lac, and they do follow the money. That is important to them, and that's one of the things that government can do is to create incentives financially. I'll take water for an example. I know that the sewage and the water amount that is used in Fond du Lac has actually stayed very stable and in some respects gone down. Because companies have done things like put in gray water systems, but nobody ever talks about that. And so our water usage in Fond du Lac from industry is way down, and they've done it because it's economically a right thing to do, and overall it has helped us. And so those are places where they can do incentives that businesses will do the right things. And they will do the right things, not always just because they're the thing to do, but because there has been a carrot given to them, and why not? What's wrong with that? So they're not all bad. We just have to know how to address what they're about and to help them get to the right place. And I think lots of times we argue about laws about that, because obviously if they see a way that they can avoid taxes, they will, but tax incentives can help them to do the right thing and improve overall everything that, our environment. Not perhaps as much as some of us would like, but quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's an open question for both panelists here in terms of we often focus on, I want to say, pure regulations, right? But what can even the EPA or what can others do in government to really provide tax credits, tax incentives, sort of, positive, I want to say, programs that really kind of encourage the right thing to do for companies?
I don't know the full extent of the programs, but I do know that there are, for example, the Energy Star program is an example where EPA has recognized companies that have been proactive in having energy efficient appliances, and that that's not regulation, that's giving them visibility and good PR. Another example is that EPA initiated. Sometimes EPA is constrained by what the statutes provide, but there is called various things, but I know in air it's called emissions trading, where you can define a district and set a general goal for emissions limits, and then basically have a market-based approach among the companies in that area to those that are better equipped to control their emissions can sell emission rights to companies that are less equipped, and so that's really it's a sort of hybrid. It's somewhat regulatory, but it's also a market-based approach. So there are lots of things that EPA has looked at to motivate companies, and I agree that the majority of companies are good actors. In my 30-year career at EPA, I've had countless very productive collaborative interactions with people in industry. I mean, generally it's been very collegial. I've had a great working relationship with the chemical industry, for example, in trying to introduce electronic reporting. They were great people to work with. So I wouldn't accord industry, blind trust, but I think, by and large, people are. I mean, they're people first. They're American citizens first. They care about the world like everyone else. And as Ted said, they're.
Well, Ted Sorenson many times. I don't mind. Especially for people from Washington. There's sort of an enlightened self-interest in doing the right thing, because if you do the right thing, then as Steve's pointed out, you're likely to be around.
longer than if you do the wrong thing. I mean, we've seen that with Volkswagen recently.
Do you also wish to respond to the word?
Yeah, I mean, you should know that there are not only programs where the government is assisting, but the other thing that's really happening is other businesses are helping other businesses. 3M, DuPont, I mean, some of these companies are reaching out to their supply chain or their customer chain, and they're saying, we want you in business, here's what we can give you to help you clean up your product in your situation. I mean, the other thing that the state of Wisconsin is finally doing is it's allowing us to use brownfields. You know, rather than telling a company that, you know, you're gonna have to, if you wanna use this vacated area, it's gonna cost you millions of dollars or billions of dollars to clean this up. So what do? They go to the field outside of town that's pristine farmland and they'll build there, because it's a lot cheaper than building on this contaminated parcel along the river. Well, we now have allowed that contaminated area to be used with new techniques and new systems. Yes, there's still contamination in the ground, but we seal it, we do what we can. And in that way, we're saving some pristine land out where they're not building a golf course, but they're still farming fields. So that works. And I think that cooperation is what we need to work towards. We need to get a better industry government cooperation, and we need more flexibility in the regulations that aren't such mandates, that such chiseled in stone rules.
Okay, we have two final questions. No, Rick had a question.
My question was whether any of the students in the audience had a question. So far as all of us old folks asked.
I see Rose in the back, yeah.
I just want to know what happens when the consumer trend to care about the environment, to have corporate social responsibility programs ends. You know, these sorts of trends go into flows. You know, people cared in the early 2000s when Al Gore brought up climate change and they stopped because the recession happened. Does that mean corporations shouldn't have these programs anymore? I know that this can, like, caring about the environment and also like allowing businesses to be businesses can happen with market solutions, but what happens when consumers don't care about that trend anymore? Does that make it any less necessary?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question is what happens when the consumers don't care anymore and the trend is going? You need to look to Europe, because Europe's a classic example. The trend went away, Europe kept cleaning up their businesses. They kept cleaning up their industries. Why? Because that's where the money was. They have profitability, and you know, and there's a company, there's another organization you want to check out. It's Republican, but it's kind of cute because it's EN instead of AN in the word Republican. It's Republican, it's Republic Environment, but it's run by a Republican out of South Carolina, I think is where he's from, former representative. Anyway, they talk about the European model, and I think that's a good model to look at. I don't think you're going to see a wind back. I think the biggest problem is we thought the resources of the United States at one time were just limitless. You know, we cut all the trees down, and we just kept moving west, and we ran into an ocean or something. And so I don't think you're going to see that. And I think Europe's a good example of that.
There was another student that raised his hand, William in this case.
So I think that when a lot of people think of the Environmental Protection Agency, they view it as just having a bunch of rules and regulations, a bunch of don'ts. And overall, humans seem to respond to incentives. I talk about it in my senior thesis paper. What specific incentives would you like to see the EPA offer businesses or private citizens to get to, I guess, to clean the environment, whether that be the air, water, land, whatnot? What specific initiatives would you like to see the EPA offer?
The specific incentives I'd like to see the EPA or any environmental agency offer to is, I'll come in, I'll identify your problem, I'll help you clean it up, and I won't fine you. In other words, I'll take the money that you're going to spend, you know, paying me a big fine, and instead I'm going to say, let's spend that money correcting the problem. Let's take our expertise from the EPA and our scientists and our people and quit making them police officers and start making them, maybe to use the colloquial phrase, social workers, helping solve the problem. Now, I live in Pollyanna world at this point, which I don't very often get to, but that's what I would like to see.
I think that there is some of that, and again, it's very often at the state level, but I talked earlier about compliance agreements, and there are many cases where, you know, a company is out of compliance, and rather than pay huge fines, the company and the regulatory authority negotiate an agreement where, you know, the company will basically mend its ways and get itself to clean, and in return, legal penalties are either dropped or they're minimized. And I think EPA, I mean, to the extent that it's partly a resource issue as well, I think that to the extent that there are resources, EPA does reach out to industries. There are many cases where there are industry conferences, there's trade shows that EPA participates in, tries to promote market-based solutions based on, you know, technologies. I mean, you know, if someone has some sort of new, you know, environmental protection technology that might be useful for cleaning up the effluent, EPA is very often on it, and in some cases, you know, we, as a federal agency, the EPA has to be careful not to endorse specific companies, but there have been programs of certifying, you know, products and services that you know, that companies can use. So EPA, you know, to the extent that it has resources, is trying to foster marketplace solutions. It's just that what you have to realize is that its mandate is framed by statutes, and it has to carry out its statutory obligations, and that does involve, among other things, a lot of regulation. But certainly there are a lot of people in the agency who are very interested in these more creative approaches, because we recognize that there has to be a federal industry partnership to get some of these problems solved.
I know there were quite a few more hands up. We only have so much time. I don't want to extend it, you know, beyond 75 minutes. I know Rick and Judge Wilk, they both had questions. Maybe real quick.
How do you deal with the major municipalities? Last week there was a huge story about New York City shipping its waste down to Alabama in rail cars and leaving it there, and it stinks, it's terrible. Or, for example, Milwaukee has what's called a deep tunnel, and every year they're flushing millions and millions of gallons of effluent into Lake Michigan. It's always bothered me that this goes on. Do you have any way to deal with these situations?
I don't know enough about those programs to give you an answer, but
many metropolitan areas, I guess use New York,
right,
ships by rail car open garbage, basically stinking
it should
down
be
to Alabama for spreading out or putting into waste areas. That's just.
It should be. I mean, I don't know, but the question I would ask is, isn't this covered by the solid waste regulations or hazardous waste regulations? Because it sounds like the sort of thing that should be manifested with a requirement that it end up in an appropriate treatment, storage, or disposal facility. And if that's not happening, that's a puzzle to me. But I don't know why. I don't know.
In Milwaukee, they dump it into the Great Lakes. It goes into Lake Michigan. Millions and millions of gallons of untreated sewage because they don't have the capacity to treat it.
Well, that treatment facility ought to have a permit for dumping what they're dumping, and so if the permit allows that, you know, it's a puzzle. If they don't have a permit, then I think there's an enforcement issue.
I was asking a question.
Yeah, I don't know, but it seems like there are some tools available that could be used if there was the political will.
Rick, last question?
I was just gonna say that, municipalities always tend to get treated more favorably at an enforcement setting than private corporations tend to do. That's just my observation over a lot of years of doing this stuff. And the other thing, what Steve and David described was called a supplemental environmental project. In an enforcement context, you can often get a reduction in penalty if you do something above and beyond the minimum requirements of an environmental statute, and they'll give you credit against what otherwise would have been a forfeiture. So some of that stuff's already in place, plus the brownfields initiatives that Steve said, rather than going out and gobbling up pristine farmland and trying to recycle some of these urban former factory sites. That's what a brownfield is.
Thank you for this comment. Let me just make a quick announcement. Our next event will be here in 2 weeks. We'll have a student debate at 4:30, Little Theater. We always have at least one student debate each semester, 3 interesting topics. So hopefully we will see many of you again in here in 2 weeks. And let's give it up one more time for our panelists here today.